Okay, so you want to get up to speed on big news stories like right away.
Fast, but without missing anything important.
Exactly. We're aiming for that.
Definitely.
And today we are diving deep into President Trump's executive order from March 20th, 2025.
Yeah, this is the one that kicks off the whole process of dismantling the U.S. Department of Education.
Big stuff. We're going to sort through all the noise from all the different reports and give you the key takeaways.
So you get what you need without, getting lost in the weeds.
Exactly. So this executive order,
Signed on March 20th at the White House.
right there at the White House.
It directs Secretary of Education Linda McMahon to start basically, shutting down the Department of Education.
Okay, so she's got to figure out how to close up shop.
And the goal, the big picture, is to shift education authority back to the states.
Interesting. So this is about giving power back to individual states.
That's the idea. No, what's really interesting is how they frame this whole thing in the language of the order.
Oh, yeah. How do they spin it?
It's all about, improving education outcomes by empowering parents, states, and communities.
Sounds pretty catchy.
Total nod to the parental rights movement.
Makes sense.
And then it gets really specific, like it zeroes in on programs promoting DEI.
DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
You got it.
Yeah.
And anything they consider gender ideologies.
So they're taking aim at those.
And they're labeling them as illegal discrimination, which is...
Wow, so strong language there. But can an executive order actually wipe out a whole department?
Well, not exactly.
Legally speaking.
Right. You see, the Department of Education was created by an act of Congress back in 1979.
Okay. So
to get rid of it, you need a new law passed by Congress.
I see.
Which could be a really tough hurdle to clear.
Especially these days.
Absolutely. And then you've got the Senate filibuster looming, which needs 60 votes to overcome.
So this executive order is more like the opening move.
Yeah, it's the first shot fired in what could be a really long legal and political battle.
And this isn't even the first time someone's tried to dismantle the Department of Education, is it?
No, not at all. It's actually kind of a recurring theme in American history.
Really?
Yeah, like way back after the Civil War, we had a federal education department for a little while.
Huh, I never knew that.
And more recently, you had President Reagan try to do the same thing in the 80s.
But he couldn't pull it off.
Congress blocked them back then.
So this idea's been floating around for a while.
For sure. And these days, you've got groups like Project 2025 who are pushing hard to end the Department of Education altogether.
They're not messing around.
Nope. They even want to eliminate things like Head Start and Title I.
Which is huge. Title is all about funding for schools with lots of low-income students.
Exactly. It's a massive program.
Yeah.
So there are some pretty strong feelings on both sides of this issue.
For sure. So let's break it down. What are the main arguments for and against keeping the Department of Education?
So those who want to get rid of it usually talk about giving states more control.
So the states' rights argument.
Right. They also often argue that the federal government creates too much bureaucracy.
Less red tape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of whether the federal government actually improves education outcomes.
So is it even worth it?
That's their point. Now, those who support the department say it's absolutely vital for ensuring everyone has equal access to good education.
A level playing field.
Exactly. And they say it's essential for protecting civil rights in education.
Making sure everyone is treated fairly.
And, of course, they point to the crucial funding it provides.
So lots of schools rely on that money.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's zoom in for a second. What exactly does the Department of Education do on a daily basis?
So it's a cabinet-level agency, which means it's pretty high up there.
Important stuff.
Yeah. And its main job is to oversee federal education policy and funding.
Sounds like a lot of responsibility.
It is. They manage all the federal student aid programs, like student loans and Pell Grants.
Those Pell Grants are a lifeline for a lot of students who need financial aid.
For sure. Then they support K-12 education through programs like Title I and IDEA.
IDEA, that's the one for students with disabilities, right?
Yep. And make sure they get the services they need. And the department also enforces civil rights in education through the Office for Civil Rights.
Okay, so they're making sure everyone's treated fairly.
Exactly. And they also collect and analyze all kinds of education data and research.
So keeping track of how things are going.
Exactly. Now, it's interesting to note that even though the federal government only provides about 8% of funding for K-12 education.
So most of the money comes from elsewhere.
Right. But even with that small percentage, the department has a really significant impact on education across the country.
Huh. That's pretty surprising.
It is. So now let's talk about what might happen if the department actually gets dismantled.
Yeah, what are the potential consequences for everyday people?
Well, that's the big question mark right now.
Lots of unknowns.
Exactly. People are worried about what would happen to all those federal funding streams.
Like the Pell Grants Title I idea.
All of that. Would they still exist? How would the money be distributed?
Good questions.
There's been talk about giving block grants to states.
So basically giving each state a chunk of money and letting them decide how to use it.
Right. But that raises concerns about reduced federal oversight.
Right. So potentially less accountability.
And their worries about uneven funding across the country.
Meaning some states might get more than others.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of civil rights enforcement.
Would that be weakened without the department?
That's a big concern. And of course, people are worried about the impact on students with disabilities.
Who rely on IDA for support.
Right. And even education research could be affected.
Less data, less information.
Exactly. So overall, there's some really big implications for educational equity and access.
So dismantling the department could potentially create a whole lot of problems.
That's the fear.
So how are people reacting to this whole thing?
Predictably, it's been a very divisive issue.
Two sides of the coin.
Exactly. You've got Republicans like Senator Cassidy and Governor Abbott who are all for it.
They're in favor of giving more power back to the states.
Exactly. States' rights is a big argument for them.
Makes sense.
On the other side, you've got Democrats like Senator Schumer and organizations like the NAACP who are strongly opposed.
They see this as a bad move for students.
They're worried about the potential harm to vulnerable students especially.
Makes sense.
And the teachers' unions, the AFT and NEA, are also against it.
They're big players in education.
They are. They're concerned about the loss of protections for students.
So it's a pretty heated debate.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And getting any related legislation through Congress is going to be a huge challenge.
Especially with that Senate filibuster we talked about.
Right. And then you've got the legal challenges that are almost certain to come up.
So this is far from over.
Not by a long shot.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, polls suggest that most Americans actually don't want to see the department dismantled.
Huh. So public opinion doesn't seem to be on board with this.
Not really.
So to sum it all up, what's the key takeaway from all of this?
The main point is that this executive order from President Trump is a big first step, but it doesn't actually dissolve the Department of Education.
He can't just snap his fingers and make it disappear.
Exactly. It takes an act of Congress to do that. The White House is arguing that this is all about improving education by giving more power to states and parents.
Empowering the people.
Right. But those who are against it argue that it's going to harm vulnerable students and weaken important federal oversight, especially when it comes to civil rights.
So there's some serious concerns.
Definitely.
So this executive order is like the opening move in a much bigger game.
Exactly. The real future of the Department of Education hinges on what Congress does and what happens in the courts.
So we'll have to wait and see how it all plays out.
For sure.
Yeah.
And this whole situation really highlights just how much debate there is about the role of the federal government in education.
A fundamental question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, given all the historical attempts to do this and the current political climate, what kind of long-term shifts in American education might this initiative ultimately represent?
Regardless of whether the department actually gets dismantled or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a question worth pondering.
Absolutely.
It really is.
Food for thought.
For sure.
All right. Well, thanks for breaking all that down.
My pleasure.
That was a lot to unpack.
It was a deep dive.
A deep dive indeed.